It is said that a simple man named John lived a life marked by exhaustion, faith, and deprivation. He was a man with hands calloused by the earth and the sun, and a serene gaze, though his heart carried the invisible weight of worries. To him, poverty was not just the absence of money, but a constant wound in the soul. The helplessness of not being able to relieve the simplest needs, the anguish of being unable to offer more than effort in a world that measured value by riches. Every morning, before the sun rose over the desert dunes, John was already on his feet. The air was still cold, and the crowing of the roosters barely broke the silence. He walked to the fields with slow but steady steps, carrying in his hands the worn tools that had accompanied him for years. Under the scorching sun, he worked without rest, ploughing the parched earth, sowing with hope, and watering the crops with the sweat that dripped from his brow. He was a man who knew the taste of sacrifice, but also the value of perseverance. He did not dream of luxury or comfort. His only desire was to earn his daily bread and keep the dignity of his home alive. He lived with his wife, Helen, in a humble mud cabin built on the edge of the desert, where the nights were cold and the winds whistled like ancient laments. Despite their poverty, that house had been their refuge, a small world where love and hope reigned. But as the years passed, that warmth began to fade slowly. Every afternoon, John returned from the field, dragging the weariness in his feet and hands empty of plenty, though full of effort. He brought with him only a little bread or some withered fruit, just enough to survive another day. His body was exhausted, but his smile was the same, a mask of strength with which he tried to hide from Helen the sadness that consumed him inside. He did not want her to see the pain he felt, knowing he was unable to offer her more. However, in his heart, there was a sorrow deeper than poverty. For many years, he and Helen had been waiting for a child, a blessing that would give meaning to his sacrifice and fill their small house with laughter and hope. But time passed without answers, and the silence of childless nights became increasingly heavy. Sometimes, while watching the stars, John wondered if God had forgotten him, or if that trial had a purpose he could not yet understand. Desperate, he traveled through nearby villages seeking a solution. He consulted healers, wise men, and elders, wishing to know the secrets of fertility. They all agreed on the same thing. Your wife needs a special treatment made with rare herbs that grow far from here, but the price is very high. These words pierced his heart like thorns. How could a man who barely secured his daily food pay for something like that? That night, as he watched Helen sleep with a face weary from years of waiting, John felt a mixture of helplessness and pain. Life was testing him on all fronts: poverty in his pocket, deprivation in his heart, and a faith that was beginning to waver. What hurt him most was not the misery, but seeing how the spark of hope in Helen's eyes was slowly going out. At first, she consoled him, saying that everything would arrive in due time. But as the days went by, her patience began to break. She no longer saw in him the noble man fighting against destiny, but rather the one to blame for a stagnant life. Helen began to look at the houses of the rich with eyes full of longing, comparing her situation to that of women who lived in comfort and plenty. She could no longer bear the poverty or the helplessness, and her harsh words began to fill the atmosphere of the small cabin. John felt that his home, that small refuge of love, was beginning to crumble. And yet, every dawn found him on his feet again, ready to fight another day, because in the depths of his soul, John believed that someday life would reward the heart that had learned to resist without surrendering. One afternoon, Helen returned from the market with a different air, as if something inside her had changed. She walked up to him, sat in front of the fire, and without looking at him directly, murmured, "Today I met an important merchant, a respected man named Richard, with lands and caravans. We talked for a bit." John did not imagine that these words would be the beginning of the collapse of his world. The merchant she spoke of was known for his fortune and power. It was said he was looking for a second wife, as the one he had not given him children. From that day on, Helen's attitude began to transform slowly. She was no longer the same. Her once soft words turned into reproaches. Her once tender gazes filled with disdain. Every day she seemed more distant, more impatient, as if something inside her had broken. "How long will we go on like this, John?" she would say. "How long this misery? You have done nothing to change it." Each phrase fell upon him like a stone. John, who had endured the heat of labour, the hardness of the field, and the weight of poverty, had never felt a pain as sharp as that of those words. She was his only hope, the refuge that gave meaning to his days. But now he felt her as far away as the stars. Time became a silent enemy. Arguments became frequent. She no longer spoke of shared dreams, but of lost opportunities. And John, though he remained silent, felt something dying inside him, until one night, destiny decided to put an end to everything. John returned from the field with numb feet and a body covered in dust. In his hands, he brought a little hardened bread, enough for a humble supper, but upon reaching his cabin, he saw her waiting at the door, motionless, with eyes as cold as the night air. "John," she said without hesitation, "this is over. I want a divorce." Time seemed to stop. He watched her without understanding, his soul suspended between incredulity and pain. He tried to speak, but his voice broke before it came out. "Don't say that, woman," he whispered. She replied coldly, "I want nothing from you, not money, not the house, not promises. You offer me nothing. We couldn't even have a child. I just want to leave." John replied, "But my love, I am working hard. Let us have patience. I know God will give us a blessing." "No, John, enough." John felt the ground disappear beneath him. He remembered the times he had worked until dusk just to see her smile. He remembered the nights they had both dreamed of having a child. He remembered every sacrifice, every tear, every prayer. But he understood that nothing could now save what they once had. He remained silent for a few seconds, looking at the dying fire, and finally pronounced the word that cut his heart in two. He let her go. She did not look back. She walked toward the path that led to the market, toward the house of that rich man who had promised her a comfortable life. John felt the silence of the desert envelop him completely. Poverty was no longer his greatest burden. Now he carried something much heavier: solitude. John remained alone in his humble mud cabin. He sat in front of the door, watching the sun disappear behind the dunes and night fall, with a silence so deep it seemed to weigh upon his chest. He did not cry only for her departure, but for everything that had gone with her. Faith in shared dreams, the warmth of the home, the illusion of a better tomorrow. He felt the world had become small and suffocating, despite its limitless vastness. The desert wind blew, dragging sand and memories, while his heart beat with an emptiness that found no consolation. He had not just lost a woman, he had lost a part of himself. And in the midst of that silence that enveloped everything, his mind repeated questions that hurt like thorns. Does loyalty always end in loss? And can it be called true love, that which vanishes before a trial? The wind did not answer, only sighed with sadness, as if it understood the weight of a man who had loved with everything and had been left with nothing. The days passed slow and heavy for John. He lived wrapped in a dense silence, only interrupted by the whisper of the wind hitting the cracked walls of his old mud cabin. His body worked, yes, but his soul wandered lost, seeking meaning in a life that poverty had emptied of everything, even human warmth. Sometimes he sat at the edge of the sown field, staring at the horizon and murmuring to himself, "Does kindness deserve to be paid with ingratitude?" He did not hate her, even after her betrayal. In his heart, there was only compassion, pity, perhaps, for a woman who did not know how to see the beauty in patience, nor understand that true wealth is not measured in coins, but in the peace of a grateful heart. That night, the sky was covered with clouds, and the half-moon barely peeped through them. The cold cut the skin, and the silence weighed like a stone. John sat in front of a small campfire and brought his thin hands close to the flickering fire. He looked at the dancing flames and murmured in a low voice, "Oh God, if this is my end, grant me at least a spark to dispel this darkness. I do not ask for riches, only for calm, only for peace." The next morning, John went out early to the field, as he usually did. The clear and serene sky had an unusual clarity, and the sun shone with a calm that seemed to announce a different day. He worked without rest until exhaustion bent his back, and then he sat on a rock near his cabin, contemplating the vast desert stretching before him. He did not know that that moment would mark a turn in his destiny. While his thoughts wandered between solitude and silence, he distinguished something moving on the sand in the distance. He narrowed his eyes, trying to understand what it was, until the figure became clearer. A starving dog, so thin that its bones showed through its skin. It moved with difficulty, staggering on the verge of collapse. Its sunken eyes reflected deep exhaustion, and its body trembled with hunger and thirst. John hesitated for a moment. He looked at the small piece of dry bread he had with him, the only thing he had to eat that day, and sighed. Then, with a soft and compassionate voice, he murmured, "Even this poor animal is hungry just like me, but he is weaker, and I still have something to give him." He broke the bread in two and offered half to the dog, saying tenderly, "Eat, friend, for the love of God." The dog approached cautiously, wagging its tail weakly, and began to devour the bread with desperation, as if it hadn't tasted a bite in days. John watched it in silence and, for the first time in a long time, felt a strange peace fill his chest. That simple act of compassion gave him back something he thought lost: his humanity. When the animal finished eating, John offered it a little water from his small canteen, though barely a few drops remained. The dog drank greedily and then looked up at him. In its eyes there was a deep glow, a silent gratitude. Then it sat for a moment beside John and suddenly began to bark softly over and over, as if trying to tell him something. John looked at it, intrigued. It wasn't a bark of fear or warning. It seemed more like a call. The dog walked a few steps toward the desert, turning its head every now and then, inviting him to follow. John hesitated an instant, but felt a voice inside him, an inexplicable sensation that urged him to get up. Perhaps it was the desire to break his solitude, or perhaps a sign from God. He stood up with effort and began to follow the animal, moving slowly through the warm sand. They walked for a long time until they reached a group of ancient rocks covered in strange inscriptions. There, the dog stopped and began to dig insistently at the foot of a large stone. John watched it in surprise and, in a low voice, as if speaking to a friend, murmured, "What are you looking for there, companion? Have I followed you in vain?" The dog did not stop. It dug with a determination that seemed guided by something more than instinct. John understood without words. He took his staff and began to help it, striking the hardened earth, ignoring the fatigue and thirst. The sand was heavy, but something inside him pushed him to continue. As he cleared the earth with effort, something glinted dimly beneath the sand. John leaned in, intrigued, and discovered a metallic piece of a copper tone that reflected the light of the setting sun. With trembling hands, he continued digging until he pulled out a small copper chest covered in dust and age. He stood motionless for a moment, panting, contemplating it with incredulity. Then he murmured in a low voice, "This is a sustenance from God." He tried to open it, but the latch was firm. He struck it several times with a sharp stone until it finally gave way with a snap. He opened the lid cautiously, expecting to find gold coins, jewels, or something of material value. However, what he found inside exceeded any expectation. Inside there was only a piece of ancient parchment, yellowed, folded with care. He took it carefully and unfolded it slowly. On it were strange drawings, symbols, and lines that crossed each other, forming a mysterious design. He observed it closely, without fully understanding what was in front of him, until a deep intuition made him realize that this was not just a simple paper. It looked like a map, a path to something unknown. John looked up and saw the dog sitting calmly beside him. He stroked its head tenderly and said with a voice full of wonder and gratitude, "You are a messenger from heaven, a sign that came to remind me that hope still lives." At that moment, John felt something ignite inside him. He was no longer the defeated and empty man he had been, but someone with a purpose, a secret, and a reason to keep going. Perhaps God had not yet granted him riches, but he had bestowed upon him something infinitely more valuable, a new hope. Later, the map and the dog led him to the front of a rock. He stood before the enormous boulder that marked the end of his search. The dog barked, as if to say he was about to discover something that would change his life. With his heart beating between fear and expectation, he looked up at the sky and murmured in a low voice, full of faith, "O Lord, if this is the path you have traced for me, give me the strength to follow it to the end." Then, with a thin pole, he pried the edge of the rock and pushed with all the strength he had left. The stone cracked with a deep sound. Slowly, the rock began to move, yielding to the determination of a man who no longer feared losing anything. When it finally moved aside, it revealed a narrow, dark passageway from which an aroma of ancient earth wafted. At that moment, John turned to stroke the dog, but it was no longer there. The animal had fulfilled its mission. John hesitated an instant, then lit his oil lamp and took the first step. Each footfall echoed twice, once off the damp walls of the cavern, and once in the depths of his soul. With every yard he advanced, he understood he was approaching not just a treasure, but the very reason life had tested him so much. After a short distance, he found himself before a small room carved into the rock, with a slanted door sealed by a light stone. He pushed it carefully, and it opened slowly. What he saw inside took his breath away. The chamber shone with a faint, golden glow coming from boxes stacked along the walls. He opened one of them, and inside found jewels that shimmered with colors he had never seen, alongside finely crafted gold pieces, the work of ancient hands. There were also bags full of coins and swords, adorned with precious stones, each silently telling stories of forgotten kings. John stood motionless, stunned. His eyes could not encompass such wonder, and his hands trembled as if they feared breaking that dream. Slowly, he sat on the floor and bowed his head. He felt no greed, but rather a deep gratitude that filled him completely. With a choked voice, he murmured, "I would not have reached this place if it were not for the mercy I sowed with my own hands. The true treasure is not this gold, but the heart that did not forget kindness, even in misery." John took from that treasure only what was necessary to start a new life, and left the rest in its place, as if understanding that this secret did not belong solely to him. He left the cave and walked with a firm step toward his village. John had changed. He was no longer the poor man fleeing his past, but someone who understood that true wealth is not measured by what one possesses, but by what one carries in the soul. He looked up at the sky and with a voice choked with emotion said, "Praise be to God, who never leaves unrewarded those who act with kindness." As the days passed, John's life began to transform. After discovering the treasure and seeing how God took him from poverty to plenty, he did not forget the nights of hunger, nor the days that taught him the value of patience and mercy. The first thing he did was repair his humble mud cabin, turning it into a spacious and serene house, worthy of a man who had tasted exhaustion and faith. But even amidst the plenty, he maintained his simplicity. He did not seek luxury or appearances, only a life in peace, steeped in gratitude and satisfaction. The people soon came to know John as a generous man, compassionate toward the poor, and always willing to extend a hand to the needy. He never forgot that piece of bread he had once shared for the love of God, without expecting anything in return. Over time, John found what was truly missing in his heart. He met a woman of noble soul and serene gaze named Anna, who did not look at his wealth or his appearance, but at the sincerity and faith that dwelt within him. He loved her deeply, because she knew how to see in his humility true manhood, and in his mercy a strength that few understood. John thanked God for granting him someone who understood the value of loyalty. Years passed, and he was blessed with a daughter whom he named Rebecca, a ray of light that illuminated his life. When he held her for the first time in his arms, he felt that the entire meaning of the world was summed up in that instant. And every time he saw her smile, he understood that the true treasure was not beneath the earth, but in the love that had flourished in his home. At the same time, Helen's life took a completely different turn. After leaving John in his poverty, she believed that wealth would give her the security she craved. She had married Richard, the rich man she met at the market, convinced he would turn her into a queen, surrounded by luxury. But as the days passed, she began to feel empty. That man was only interested in her external beauty, and his only concern was having a son to carry his name. However, she was unable to conceive. Over time, his feelings toward her cooled, until one day he looked at her with indifference and cast her out, as if she had never meant anything. She left that house without money, without family, and without direction. Then she understood that the greed that drove her away from John had only left her with solitude and regret. She sat in a neglected corner with tears that would not cease, remembering his face when he smiled at her despite the poverty. And that night when she left him, having before her a man who only offered her sincere love, the weight of regret began to consume her chest, and one single idea dominated her: to return. Perhaps, she thought, if she found him, she could still ask for his forgiveness, perhaps recover his love, the one she lost through pride. So, she undertook the path back to look for John again. Upon arrival, she stood in front of the house that was once a humble cabin. Now it was large, bright, and serene. She saw John working in the garden with a calm face and a smile that reflected peace. Beside him, Anna, the woman with the kind gaze, played with little Rebecca, whose laughter filled the air. Her heart broke. She had returned, but there was no longer a place for her. Still, she approached slowly, with her voice trembling and her eyes clouded by tears. "John," she said, barely audible, "forgive me." John looked at her in silence. There was no anger in his eyes, only deep compassion. He took a step toward her and replied with a serene voice, "I forgive you, because resentment bears no fruit, but the paths we choose have their destiny, and mine is no longer with you." She lowered her head, understanding that forgiveness does not always mean a return, and that sometimes the greatest lesson in life arrives when all that was lost can no longer be recovered. As she moved away, John looked up at the sky, thanking God for having healed his heart without hardening it. Meanwhile, John continued with his new life in peace alongside his virtuous wife Anna and his daughter Rebecca. Every morning began with thanking God, and every night ended asking for protection for his home. The treasure was no longer for him gold or jewels, but the heart full of mercy that he had learned from patience, and the family that became his true fortress in life. Friends, if you reach the end of this story, give it a like, share it, and subscribe to Fable Haven for more narratives. And remember, there are more stories on your screen. Thank you very much.